The church bell had long stopped ringing, yet the sound of a baby's cry carried through the dusty wooden pews like a wound no hymn could heal. It was sharp, desperate, echoing against the plain boards of the small chapel that stood on the edge of town. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and silent, the sun dipping low, painting the land in shades of fire and ash. Folks had already gone about their business, leaving the doors of the church open to the wind and to the sorrowful voice of a child who didn't understand why the world had grown so empty. In the back pew, swaddled in nothing more than a worn blanket, lay the widow's baby. His tiny fists clenched at the air, his face red with tears, as if calling for arms that would never return. His mother, gone too soon, had left behind not just the weight of loss but the helpless soul she loved most. No one dared to claim him. No one wanted to take on the burden. The town whispered about charity, about what was right, but whispers don't feed a child, and pity doesn't hush his cries. The baby's wails rolled through the church, accusing the silence, begging for someone to answer. At the doorway stood a man the town had nearly forgotten, or perhaps had chosen to forget. He was broad-shouldered, dust clinging to the hem of his coat, his hat pulled low over a face weathered by sun and scars of old reckonings. He lingered there, his boots heavy against the creaking boards, as if unsure whether he belonged in a place meant for prayer. Folks called him an outcast, a drifter, a cowboy who carried with him a past too wild, too broken to be forgiven. He never stayed long in one place, never let his shadow settle. Wherever he went, he found closed doors and turned shoulders. Yet, as he stepped further inside, the crying grew louder, and something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't expected. His eyes found the small bundle on the bench, trembling with hunger and loneliness. He didn't move at first, just stood there, the weight of choice pressing down heavier than any saddle. He'd been taught all his life that a man like him had no place in raising a child, no right to comfort innocence when his own hands were soiled by the past. Still, the baby's cries tore through every defense he'd built, as though demanding he set down his burdens for just one moment. He walked down the aisle slowly, the wooden boards groaning under his step. Dust swirled in the light that slipped through stained glass, painting his shadow across the pews. When he reached the baby, he hesitated again, his hand hovering above the little one as if afraid he might break him. The baby's eyes, wet and desperate, caught his, and in that instant something passed between them. The wailing softened into sobs, then into hiccups, as though the child recognized in him not danger, but the possibility of warmth. With a shaky breath, he scooped the child into his arms. The weight was slight, yet it felt heavier than any rifle, heavier than any saddlebag. The baby pressed his tiny face into the man's chest, quieting, trusting, as though he had found what he'd been searching for all along. For the first time in years, the cowboy felt something other than emptiness. He felt needed, and that frightened him more than any outlaw or gunfight ever had. The church grew still. Outside, the last light of day slipped away, leaving the world cloaked in shadow. He looked down at the child, rocking him awkwardly, whispering words he hadn't spoken since he was a boy himself. He knew the town would talk if they saw him with the widow's baby. They'd say he had no business stepping into a life he couldn't possibly provide for. They'd call it reckless, dangerous, wrong. He'd always been the outsider, the one blamed when things went wrong. To take in a baby would only give them another reason to despise him. Yet here, in the hush of the church, none of that mattered. The child didn't know of sins or rumors or scars. He only knew the comfort of arms strong enough to hold him. And the cowboy, for once, felt that maybe this was his chance to set down the mistakes of his past and carry something pure instead. The door creaked behind him, and he turned quickly, clutching the baby tighter. A figure stood in the doorway, framed by the last flickers of daylight. It was a woman, her dress plain, her eyes tired but sharp. She had been the one who found the baby first, the one who tried to plead with the townsfolk, but they'd all turned away. Her gaze fell on the cowboy, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint breaths of the child. "You know they'll never let you keep him," she said softly, her voice carrying both warning and wonder. Cowboy didn't answer. He just looked down at the baby, then back at her, his jaw set. For once he didn't care what the town thought, but outside, the sound of voices carried on the wind. Heavy boots scuffed against dirt. Lanterns flickered in the dark. The townsfolk were coming back, their whispers gathering strength like a storm. They'd seen the door left open. They'd heard the crying. They would not take kindly to finding the widow's child in the arms of a man they had long cast out. The cowboy held the baby closer, his heart pounding like hooves across the plains. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from trouble. He was standing right in the middle of it. And the choice he made in the next few minutes would change not only his life, but the fate of the little one, who had finally stopped crying in his arms. The woman in the doorway stepped inside, closing the church door behind her. The lantern light outside flickered brighter, shadows pressing closer. The child stirred, let out a soft cry, and nestled deeper against the cowboy's chest. He could hear the townsfolk drawing near, their voices sharper now, their steps heavier. Glanced at the woman, then back at the door. The baby's small hand gripped the fabric of his shirt. His chest ached with a feeling he hadn't known in years: fear, not for himself, but for the helpless life that trusted him without question. The latch rattled. Someone outside pushed against the door, and the cowboy, standing tall in the silent church with the baby in his arms, knew that whatever happened next would mark the beginning of a story he could never turn away from. The church door trembled again, the iron latch straining against the push of calloused hands on the other side. The cowboy's grip tightened around the baby, his jaw hard as stone, but his eyes revealed something unsteady, something that betrayed the weight of the choice bearing down on him. The woman stepped closer, her worn shoes whispering against the wooden floor, her gaze darting between the door and the child. She lowered her voice, though the storm of voices outside left no doubt they would be inside soon. "They won't leave it be," she murmured, her tone low but certain. "They'll call it wrong, they'll call it shameful, and they'll call you unfit." The cowboy's eyes didn't shift from the baby nestled in his arms. The child stirred, pressing a small hand against his chest as though clinging to him. Not out of choice but of instinct. He had carried rifles, saddlebags, even the weight of guilt heavier than most men could bear. But never had he carried something that felt so fragile, so new, and yet so full of promise. He whispered to the child, words meant for no one else, words that came out broken and rough, but honest. The latch rattled harder, a man's voice rising above the rest. "Open up, that baby ain't yours to claim." The woman's eyes searched the cowboy's face. There was something in her expression, pity, maybe hope, maybe even warning, that told him she'd seen men crushed by this town before. She knew what their judgment could do. Still, she didn't try to take the baby from him. Instead, she stood near, as though torn between running from the trouble and standing against it. The cowboy's mind flickered to the past, to the trail of dust he had left behind in other towns. He had been a rider without roots, drifting from one job to another, taking what work he could find, hauling cattle, driving wagons, guarding ranches from rustlers. Always he moved on when whispers grew too loud, when mistakes from his past caught up to him. Folks liked to paint men like him in black and white: outlaws, outcasts, troublemakers. They never cared to see the shade of gray that told the real story. He had never asked for redemption because he never believed it was something a man like him could earn, but the sight of the widow's baby crying alone in that church had torn open something inside him. The widow herself had been one of the few kind faces in town. She'd offered him a loaf of bread once when he had nothing in his pockets. She never asked about his past, never echoed the rumors. Then one cold night, illness took her, leaving behind this child with no one to answer his cries. The townsfolk had mourned her for a day, spoken kindly of her in passing, but when it came to the baby, they had turned their backs, muttering about how no one had the means or the heart to take on another mouth to feed. The cowboy thought about that as the shouts outside grew louder. He thought about how the townsfolk had measured their kindness in half rations, saving sympathy for Sundays and shutting their doors the rest of the week. And he thought about how the child's small fingers now held tight to him, as if deciding for both of them that he would not walk away this time. The door shuddered. A voice barked out, "We'll come in one way or another." The woman moved to the side of the room, her back against the wall, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes softened on the baby, then hardened on the cowboy. "If you mean to carry him out of here, you'll carry more than just his weight. They'll put their blame on you. They always do." The cowboy's gaze rose to the wooden cross nailed at the front of the church, the faded paint catching the last rays of evening. He had stood in plenty of chapels, though not for worship. He had stood in them when strangers laid loved ones to rest, when communities gathered to mourn or to curse. He had stood in them as an outsider, watching life unfold like a play he wasn't allowed to join. And here he was again, but this time with a life depending on him. His thoughts wandered back further still, to his own boyhood. He remembered a small cabin far from towns, a father with hands as rough as rope, a mother with eyes weary but kind. Hard winters had broken their backs. When hunger struck, his father turned mean, his mother quiet. One night, he'd been sent out into the cold with nothing but a small satchel and a warning not to come back until he could prove himself a man. He never did return. That memory sat heavy in him now, as if reminding him what it felt like to be small and unwanted, left. To cry in the dark. The baby whimpered softly, then quieted again against his chest. The cowboy exhaled a long, steady breath, one that felt like it carried years of wandering. The voices outside sharpened, impatience dripping from every word. They weren't just worried about the baby's well-being. They were worried about appearances, about what it meant to let an outcast step into the role of protector. The town thrived on its image, clinging to the illusion of order and decency. To hand over the widow's child to a man they had cast aside would be like admitting they had failed their own. And they would not let pride give way to truth. Woman's voice broke through his thoughts, gentle but steady. "If you walk out with him, you'll have to keep walking. They won't let you settle here, not with that child in your arms. But if you stay, you'll face them before the night is through." The cowboy lifted his eyes toward the narrow windows lining the chapel. Lanterns bobbed in the dark beyond the glass, shadows shifting as the townsfolk gathered closer. The baby stirred again, a faint cry escaping, as if sensing the storm pressing in. He swayed gently, rocking the child with an awkward tenderness, trying to soothe both the little one and the turmoil boiling inside him. He thought of the road endless. Miles of dust, rivers to cross, ridges to climb. He had lived that life, free but hollow. Carrying a baby on such a road was near impossible. The dangers of bandits, hunger, storms, he'd seen strong men buckle under less. Yet the thought of handing the child over to people who'd already abandoned him once twisted something sharp in his chest. The latch scraped again. A heavy shoulder pressed against the wood. The door groaned, threatening to give way. The cowboy stepped back into the aisle, cradling the baby close, his eyes never leaving the door. The woman lingered in the shadows, her breath quick, her hands wringing. She had no stake in him, no reason to stand with him. Yet she did not move to open the door, nor did she slip away into the dark. It was as though she, too, was waiting to see what kind of man he would prove himself to be. A voice outside shouted, "He don't belong to you. Hand him over before worse comes of it." The cowboy's throat tightened. His past told him to walk away to save himself before the noose of blame tightened around his neck. But the child's soft breathing against him whispered another path. He felt the weight of it in his bones, the kind of weight that didn't break a man but remade him. The doorframe shook as fists pounded harder. The night pressed in, lanterns casting long, restless shadows across the church walls. The cowboy knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Sooner or later, that door would give, and the voices would spill inside, bringing with them the judgment. He had spent his life outrunning. He looked once more at the woman, her eyes reflecting both fear and something else, something like trust. He looked down at the baby, whose tiny hand still clutched his shirt with surprising strength. And he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't known in years, the urge not to run, but to stand. The latch bent. The door sagged. The storm outside was seconds from breaking through, and there he stood, the outcast cowboy with the widow's child in his arms, caught between a past that had hunted him and a future he had never believed possible. The church. Air grew thick, every sound louder, every breath sharper. As the night prepared to decide his fate, the door gave way with a gasp of splinters, and a rush of night air pushed into the church. Lantern lights spilled across the aisle and climbed the walls like restless fire. The cowboy did not flinch. He stood firm with the widow's baby tucked to his chest while a cluster of townsfolk crowded the threshold. Their faces were tight from long days and longer fears. The blacksmith stood in front, sleeves rolled, jaw clenched. Behind him came the storekeeper, 2 ranch hands, and a deacon with a bent hat. The sheriff stepped in last, not speaking yet, watching the room as if counting where the trouble might jump. The woman kept to the side of the aisle. She held her hand still and breathed slow, trying not to startle the child. The baby made a small sound, then went quiet again, as if he understood that the room had changed. He pressed his face to the cowboy's coat and held fast to his shirt. The deacon spoke first. His voice carried a careful tone meant to sound righteous and calm. "You can hand him over, son. We'll see him to the mission house till we sort a proper home." The cowboy did not move. "You had all day to do that." A murmur ran through the group. The blacksmith bristled. "We were gaining a plan." "While he cried alone," the woman said, the quiet in her words cutting more than anger would have. She stepped forward then, closer to the cowboy but not touching him, as if to show that she made her choice too. The sheriff lifted a hand. He was a tall man with a worn badge and eyes that missed a little. "No one's taking anyone by force tonight. We talk first." He looked to the cowboy. "You're a hard man to place. Folks say you keep to yourself and trouble to you. That may be unfair or not. I ain't the judge. But the town has an interest in the boy." "The town had an interest in leaving him," the cowboy said. His voice was low and steady. "The widow gave bread when she had little. She's gone. You all said prayers, then shut the doors. That's the measure I saw." The sheriff's mouth pressed thin. The storekeeper shifted his feet. "We're honest people here. There's been drought. There's been sickness. We can't take on every sorrow." "You don't need to take on every sorrow," the woman said. "Just this one." A lantern hissed as a moth struck it. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. The baby stirred again, and the cowboy rocked him a little, awkward but sure. The sheriff watched that movement. He saw a man who held a child like he expected to be judged for it, yet who did not let go. From the porch, another voice rose. It was the preacher. He was slower than the others and had arrived late, but now he stood inside the door and lifted a hand toward the cross. "We must remember the widow's kindness," he said. A child is not a ledger entry. He will hear what we say tonight in the years to come, even if he cannot understand now. The blacksmith shook his head. That is fine talk. But this is an outcast who drifts. He'll move on and leave the baby on the trail. The woman's eyes flashed. You don't know what he'll do. The cowboy breathed in, steadying himself. You think I will cut and run? I done that plenty in my life. Maybe more times than a decent man could count. But I won't put this one down. Not tonight. His gaze rose to the sheriff. If you plan to lock me up for holding him, then do it. If not, say your piece plain. The sheriff did not reach for his cuffs. He looked at the woman instead. You found the boy first. You tried to gather help. Tell it straight. She told it straight. She spoke of the afternoon when the widow's cottage went quiet, how worry turned to fear, then grief. She told how the town brought a simple burial, how the baby cried through it. She told how she brought milk and blankets, then came to the church for the quiet and light. I sat there, she said, pointing to the back pew. I waited for a soul with a bigger heart than fear. He came. The deacon frowned. That is not church order. The preacher's gaze sharpened. Maybe it is exactly that. Outside, the wind picked up across the open prairie. The doors groaned on their hinges. The sheriff moved down the aisle. He stood close to the cowboy and looked the baby over the way a lawman checks a horse before a long ride. The child blinked up, cheeks damp, breath even. The sheriff nodded. To himself, he's calmer now. He needed arms, the cowboy said, almost to himself. The sheriff spoke to the crowd. He is fed and warm for the moment. No one's life is in danger. That means we slow our temper. He looked back to the cowboy. If you take responsibility, that is a claim. A claim draws eyes. Folks will test it. Some out here think you are tied to rustlers down the river. There have been cattle lost this month. The big ranch wants a neck for it. They might try to pin you. You keep the boy. You step onto a road with enemies in the dust. I got enemies already, the cowboy said. Only thing new is I hold him while they try to find me. The woman turned to the preacher. Is the mission house safe? The preacher hesitated. The mission house is clean and decent. But the ledger is thin and winter is close. A child without a protector gets lost in the shuffle. I cannot lie and say it would be more than survival. The storekeeper stared at his boots. The blacksmith's anger cooled to a slow heat that settled. Behind his eyes, the deacon seemed to shrink. The sheriff looked from face to face, sensing the edge softening. It was then that another man stepped into the church, bringing with him a colder draft than the evening air. He wore fine trail clothes, and a grin that did not reach his eyes. At his side hung a polished pistol. A small badge pinned to his vest showed he worked as a foreman for the biggest ranch in the county. He touched the brim of his hat to the preacher and the sheriff, then looked at the cowboy with something close to pleasure. Heard a baby found himself a new father, he said. Thought I'd see the show. The sheriff's jaw worked. This is town business. Everything's ranch business when cattle go missing, the foreman said. He made a show of glancing over the child. Sweet little thing. Shame his mother left debts. The woman stiffened. She owed nothing. That land on the south edge says different, the foreman answered. The deed is not clean. The ranch will file for it by morning. House and all. That's a widow's cottage, the preacher said. Soon it's ranch cottage, the foreman said with the same dry grin. And what of her child? A burden for the common good, I suppose. He let the words hang like a snake in the rafters. Unless some man of means takes him on. The cowboy felt the old sense of a trap being sprung. The ranch did not care for the child. It cared for the land deed and for a chance to cut down a man it saw as weak. The foreman stepped closer and lowered his voice. You keep that boy. You'll be a mark Our riders lost 20 head? I will swear I saw you near the river bridge last week. Folks will believe it. They love a story where the villain wears dust. The sheriff spoke, sharp now. You will swear only what you saw. I saw what I needed, the foreman said, and smiled for the crowd. We all want safety and order. The church, the store, the barn. Nothing ruins a town faster than hungry children and loose men. We can fix both tonight if we use some sense. The woman moved before the sheriff could answer. She stood between the foreman and the cowboy, her back straight though her hands trembled. You leave him be, she said. You leave the child. Be most of all. He tipped his hat at her. I do admire your heart. He turned to the crowd. But heart don't pay. The preacher's voice cracked like a whip. The boy is not a coin. Outside, a few more ranch hands had gathered near the yard fence, their silhouettes tall in the lantern light. A horse clinked its bit. The tension in the church took on a new shape. It was no longer about pity or shame. It was about power and fear. The sheriff sensed it too. He stepped forward and faced the foreman. You stir this any further and I will call it tampering. Take your men and go. The foreman's smile cooled. We will go when the matter's clear. It is clear, the sheriff said in a tone. That left little room. For tonight the boy stays where he is, in arms that hold him. Tomorrow we meet at the office. Bring any papers about the land. Bring any witness you claim to have about the river. But you will not pull men into this church and scare a child. Silence held for 3 breaths. The foreman gave a thin nod, eyes still bright with threat. Morning, then. He turned for the door, but he paused near the cowboy. You should. Keep riding, drifter. A baby slows the horse, and the prairie is not kind. He left. The ranch hands melted back into the dark. The sheriff let out a breath. That bought us hours, not days. He glanced around. Anyone who wants to help. Fetch milk, clean linen, and a cradle if you have one. The boy will sleep here tonight under church roof. He looked to the preacher. You keep watch? I will, the preacher said. The crowd shifted and thinned. Some folks left quick, ashamed of their noise. Others lingered, eyeing the cowboy. With new worry, the blacksmith came closer at last. He rubbed a hand over his face. I spoke hard. My wife is sick and I am mean from it. If you keep the child, I can fix a proper bed frame. No charge. He turned and left before pride could stop him. The woman exhaled shakily. She looked up at the cowboy. Thank you for not giving him up. I didn't do it right, he said. I only did what I could think to do. She studied him for a moment, as if she wanted to read the lines that time had cut into his face. You were near the river last week? I was riding to the crossing to look for work. I never went near their brand. They want a name to blame. Mine is handy. She nodded slowly. Then we prove it. He almost smiled, surprised by the we in her voice. But the baby stirred and gave a small cry, and the moment passed into the next need. The preacher brought a bottle warmed over the stove in the church house. The cowboy seated himself on a bench and fed the child, stiff at first, then looser. As the little one latched and drank, the woman sat close and adjusted the blanket with a gentleness that made the baby relax even more. The church, so tense a short time ago, shifted to a fragile calm. They spoke in low voices. The woman told how she had come to town after a bad season on the trail with her brother. She did washing, took in mending, kept to herself. She had known the widow as a friend who traded soup and stories. She had left 2 days ago to help at a ranch kitchen and returned to find the cottage doors open and the child crying. The preacher added that the widow had fenced a small piece of dry land that the big ranch wanted as a crossing for its herd. She had refused to sell. Now the ranch saw a chance to claim it through papers and pressure. The sheriff came back from the yard and knelt by the pew. There's more. The ranch claims a witness who saw you near a busted corral gate. He is a drifter like you, quick, with a tail when coin is offered. If they push it to court in Dustin County, the judge leans ranch side. I can hold them off for a time with questions and form, but I will need better proof. What proof? The woman asked. A mark on a shoe, the sheriff said. A track at the river that does not match this man's horse. A brand found, fresh over a fire. Anything that tells a story cleaner than theirs. The cowboy watched the baby finish and burp a little. He felt the small body settle against him in trust, warm and still. I will ride at first light, he said. I will bring back something true. You will not ride alone, the woman said. I know the low trail near the reeds where tracks hold. The sheriff frowned. It could be rough. It is. Rough already, she answered. Besides, someone needs to hold the boy while he reads the ground. The preacher set a hand on the pew. I will keep him safe under church roof till you return. The plan hung in the air like a bridge half. Built over a fast river, it might hold, it might not. The church lamps burned lower. The town settled into the kind of quiet that comes after argument, when people lie awake and rehearse each word they should have said. From the shadows near the back, a small figure shifted. A boy stepped forward, maybe 12 years old, thin as a switch, with a hat too big for him. He had been hiding, listening. He stared at the cowboy with a jumpy mix of fear and respect. I know a thing, he whispered. The foreman keeps a ledger under his desk at the ranch office. It has marks for every head moved and every man paid. My older brother helped move a brand through Black Gully last week. He swore to me the count was wrong. He said they were adding cattle that weren't theirs and paying riders to swear to it. He told me and then told me to forget it, but I could not. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. Why tell us now? The boy scratched at his sleeve. Because that baby ain't done nothing to no one. And because my brother left town this morning with fear in him. The room went still. The woman reached for the boy's hand and squeezed it once. The cowboy felt the weight of the child rise and fall. With steady breath, he looked to the sheriff and saw the same thought form there. Ledger pages could turn into nails that fixed the truth. The sheriff stood. This changes the shape. The office will be guarded by night, but a guard gets lazy in cold hours. We split our efforts. At dawn you two look for tracks and sign near the river. I will have a word with the night watch by the ranch gate and find a way to see that ledger. Preacher, you keep the boy and you keep eyes on the road. If riders come fast, ring the bell hard. He paused, considering the faces that watched him. No one breathes a word of this to the tip. Wrong ears. The ranch plays rough when it smells a threat. The plan set something alive in the cowboy's chest. It was not hope yet, but it was near to it. He looked down at the sleeping child and felt a vow harden in him like cooling iron. He would not let the boy become a token in another man's game. He would not be the drifter who rode away when the wind shifted. He would be the one who stayed and fought fair. The sheriff left to make quiet rounds. The woman rose to fetch more cloth for a bed. The preacher hummed a low hymn while he carried in a small cradle from the storehouse. The church took on the soft rhythm of work, simple and careful. Outside, the prairie wind turned colder, and far off a coyote called Dot near midnight, the last lamp was trimmed. The cowboy laid the baby in the cradle and watched him sleep, one hand resting across the small blanket as if to hold the world steady. The woman sat on the next pew, eyes half closed but alert. She looked toward the door every few moments, listening. Soft scrapes sounded at the window. The preacher straightened. The woman sat up. The cowboy lifted his head and moved between the cradle and the sound. Another scrape came, slow and certain. Someone was testing the latch from outside with a knife blade or wire. The preacher reached for the poker by the stove. The woman took a breath and went very still. A shadow passed across the glass. A whispered curse drifted in, and the shape moved toward the side door that led to the small office where the church kept its poor box and records. The cowboy's eyes met the preacher's eyes. He saw the same thought there again. Someone did not want a ledger found. Someone did not want the sheriff to walk into mourning with proof. The latch on the side door clicked, quiet but clear. The cowboy stepped forward, every sense sharpened, hands empty by choice so he could move faster. Behind him, the baby turned in his sleep, then settled. The woman rose without a sound and took her place near the cradle, ready to lift the child if she had to run. The side door eased open an inch. Cold air and the scent of horse and tobacco slid through. A gloved hand appeared, feeling for the hinge pin. The church felt smaller with that hand in it, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to hear what would happen next. The cowboy did not breathe as the gloved hand eased the door open wider. The sound of the hinge carried like thunder in the silence. The preacher gripped the iron poker tighter, his knuckles white. The woman pressed close to the cradle, her arms half wrapped around the baby even before danger had stepped all the way in. The cowboy moved with slow precision, his boots silent on the church floor, his eyes fixed on the shadow slipping through the crack of the door. The intruder was careful, crouched low, trying to blend with the dark edges of the room. The faint light from the dying lamp caught a sliver of his face, and the cowboy recognized him. One of the ranch foreman's men. A rider with a crooked nose, known for following orders without asking questions. He had no interest in prayer or hymn. He was here for something hidden, and the cowboy knew the ledger was the prize. The man paused, listening. He thought the room was asleep. He reached into his coat and pulled a small tin box, then slid it under the pew nearest the office door. The faint rattle inside told its own story. The cowboy's gut tightened. It was not coin, not food. It was oil and cloth wrapped around something meant to start fire quick and hot. The ranch was not only after proof. They were ready to burn the church to the ground if it meant wiping out the truth and anyone who stood near it. The cowboy stepped out of the shadows before the man could strike a match. His voice cut the silence with steel. Put it down. The something. Ryder jerked, startled. His eyes met the cowboy's, then flicked to the preacher with the poker, then to the woman guarding the cradle. For a heartbeat, he seemed to measure his chances. Then he forced a smirk. Didn't figure to find the drifter awake. You'll figure wrong again if you light that rag, the cowboy said. His stance was loose but ready, shoulders squared. One hand hovering near his belt. The rider rose slow, box still in hand. This ain't about a baby. It's about land and cattle. You folks are in over your heads. You're the one standing in church with fire, the preacher said, his voice sharp as a blade. You're the one who will answer for it. The man's smirk faded. He shifted his weight, thinking of escape. But the cowboy moved closer, cutting off the path. Their eyes locked, each waiting for the other to flinch first. The baby whimpered, sensing the danger, and the woman rocked him gently, whispering low comfort. The sound was small but steady. The only thing in the room that felt human enough to calm the blood heat rising. The rider's jaw worked, and then he shoved the tin box toward the floor as if to make a distraction. The cowboy lunged, faster than the man expected. His hand clamped around the rider's wrist, twisting hard until the box clattered harmless to the floor. The rider cursed, tried to swing his free arm, but the preacher was already there, poker raised. One sharp crack against the rider's forearm sent him stumbling back, pain twisting his face. The cowboy shoved him against the wall, forearm pressed tight across his chest. Who sent you? His voice was low, dangerous. The rider spat to the side. You already know. The sheriff's boots thundered across the porch at that moment. He burst through the main doors, drawn by the commotion. His eyes swept the scene in a second, the cowboy pinning the rider, the preacher steady with the poker, the woman guarding the child, the tin box lying open with oil-soaked cloth visible inside. His jaw hardened. "Take him outside," the sheriff ordered. The cowboy shoved the rider toward him. The sheriff grabbed the man by the collar, dragging him through the door like a sack of grain. The night air swallowed their struggle, but the tension in the church did not ease. The woman's arms trembled as she soothed the child, though her voice never broke. The preacher set the poker down at last, chest heaving from the weight of what almost happened. The cowboy picked up the tin box and shut it tight. His hands smelled of oil and smoke. He carried it to the stove, where the preacher doused it with water until the rags were soaked and harmless. When the sheriff came back, his face was grim. "I locked him in the tool shed at the back of my office. He won't be loose till morning." He looked at the cowboy. "You were right. They mean to erase more than cattle marks. They mean to erase you, the boy, and anyone that stands in their way." The cowboy met his eyes steady. "Then we move faster." The sheriff nodded. "At dawn, no later." The church quieted after that, but the calm was thin as glass. Each sound of the wind outside felt like a rider's breath. Each creak of the boards underfoot felt like the weight of more men coming. The woman sat with the baby curled against her shoulder. She whispered songs soft as river water, songs her mother used to hum. The cowboy sat near, not daring to close. His thoughts drifted to every time he had run before, every fire he had left smoldering behind him. But this was different. The baby's breath against the woman's neck was steady and warm. It pulled him into a vow that had no words, only weight. The preacher lit another lamp, its glow spilling across the pews. "You two must ride careful," he said. "The ranch will not fight fair. They will set traps where the trail narrows." "We'll take the reed trail," the woman said. "Few men ride it. Tracks hold better there," the sheriff agreed. "And I'll take a look at that ledger. But if they find me inside the office, it will be a storm." "They'll find us either way," the cowboy said. "Better to choose the ground." The preacher nodded slowly. "Then the ground must hold you steady." The night dragged on, each hour a test of patience. Once, a coyote yelped close, making the baby stir. The cowboy laid a hand on the cradle, feeling the life beneath the blanket. He told himself no harm would touch the boy if he could stand against it. But the truth pressed. On him, the ranch had money, riders, sway with the law. All he had was a vow and the thin circle of souls inside the church. It felt like standing at the mouth of a canyon with a flood roaring down. Near dawn, the sky bled pale gray through the high windows. The woman packed what little they needed, blanket, bottle, scrap of bread. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her face set firm. The cowboy saddled his horse with the sheriff's help, the leather creaking in the cold air. They spoke little. Every word seemed too heavy for the hour. The preacher prayed low, hands on the cradle, asking for strength, not for himself, but for the child who could not yet ask. The boy who had spoken of the ledger returned, pale but determined. He slipped into the church, eyes darting. "I saw too. Riders near the ranch gate at midnight," he whispered. "They carried papers into the office. One had the foreman's hand on it. They keep the ledger locked, but I know the key hangs under the lamp hook by the desk." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That may be our one clean chance." The cowboy looked to the woman. She adjusted the baby against her chest and met his eyes without flinching. "We ride together. We find the truth." The sheriff lowered his voice. "And if the truth comes too late, then we fight with what we have." The cowboy answered. The baby stirred again, soft but restless, as if he sensed the world sharpening around him. The woman kissed the crown of his head. The cowboy tightened a cinch on the saddle and looked east. The horizon glowed faint with the first red streak of sun. The hour had come. The sheriff laid a hand on the cowboy's shoulder. The town is watching. Some pray you fail. Others pray you win. But all will talk of what happens today. He let his hand fall. Make sure the story is worth telling. The cowboy mounted, the horse stamping against the cold ground. The woman climbed behind him, the baby nestled safe between her and the saddle horn. She wrapped one arm around the child, the other steady on the cowboy's side. The preacher raised his hand in blessing as the horse shifted toward the trail. The boy stood at the steps, watching with wide eyes. The sheriff adjusted his hat and set off toward the ranch office, a shadow already falling across his path. The reed trail waited like a vein cut through the land, narrow and low, filled with mist rising from the river. The cowboy guided the horse into it, the woman holding the baby close, their breaths clouding in the morning chill. Behind them, the church bell hung silent, ready to ring if the preacher saw riders on the road. Every step into the trail pulled them closer to proof or ruin. The cowboy's hand brushed the revolver at his side, not in threat but in reminder. The woman whispered soft words to the baby, her voice steady though her heart raced. The air smelled of damp earth and river grass. The silence of the trail was deep, broken only by the steady beat of hooves. The cowboy's eyes scanned every bend, every shadow. He knew they were not alone. He could feel it in the way the reeds swayed though the wind was still. The ranch would not wait for courts and ledgers. They would wait for this moment when the drifter carried more than himself, when he was slow with weight. They would strike where the path narrowed. The trail curved, reeds parting just enough to show the faint glimmer of water. The horse slowed, ears flicking at a sound ahead. A shape moved in the mist, then another. Riders waiting, their outlines dark against the morning light. The cowboy's chest tightened. The woman's grip on the baby hardened. The trap was sprung, and there was no turning back. The reeds whispered as the horse slowed to a stop. The mist clung heavy, wrapping the riders in gray, but through it the cowboy counted 3 shapes waiting. Their hats low, their coats dark, their horses restless. He could feel the woman's grip tighten at his waist and hear the baby's soft cry rise against her chest. The sound carried in the quiet morning like a bell tolling across empty land. The riders shifted in their saddles at that cry, their hands moving toward their belts, their eyes never leaving the cowboy. The cowboy sat, tall in the saddle, his hand close to his revolver but not yet drawn. His voice came low, steady. This trail belongs to the river, not to the ranch. You stand in the way of a woman and her child. You reckon that makes you strong men? His words cut the stillness, hanging sharp in the air. The riders did not answer, only exchanged quick glances. They had come for a simple job, a drifter to put down, a baby to take, proof to burn. But the man before them carried himself with the weight of someone who no longer feared loss. He carried himself as if the baby's life was more than his own. The woman straightened in the saddle behind him, her face pale but fierce. You want something from us, you will have to tell the whole town why you took it, she called. Her voice cracked at the end but did not falter. The riders shifted again. They were used to threats from men, not from women with a child in their arms. For a heartbeat, the stillness held them all. Then the cowboy's horse stamped the ground and the lead rider drew his pistol. The shot rang out, shattering the morning. Quiet. The cowboy's hand was already moving. His revolver cleared the holster, his aim true. The first rider toppled from his horse, his pistol clattering against stone. The second rider spurred forward, but the cowboy swung his horse into the path, cutting the charge. They collided, dust and reeds flying. The cowboy's revolver pressed hard against the rider's chest before another sound cracked the air. The sheriff's voice carried from behind. "Hold it!" His rifle leveled steady. The preacher's prayer echoing faint in the distance as if the church itself had sent strength into the trail. The third rider hesitated, his eyes darting from the sheriff's rifle to the cowboy's revolver to the woman clutching the child. He dropped his gun into the dirt. His horse backed into the reeds, eager to be free of the standoff. The second rider, trapped under the weight of the cowboy's stare, let his pistol slip from his hand. The fight was over as quick as it had begun, though the silence that followed felt heavier than any battle cry. The sheriff rode forward, his rifle never wavering. He dismounted and bound the two living riders with rawhide straps. "The foreman sent you," he said, not a question, but a sentence. One man spat in the dirt, refusing to speak. The other muttered low, "Ledger holds his name in every deal, every false brand." He swore no one would read it. His words spilled out in fear, the truth cracking through. The sheriff's jaw hardened. "Then the law will read it, and the town will hear." The woman pressed her lips to the baby's hair, her tears falling against his soft head. The cowboy holstered his revolver, his hand trembling only once when it fell to his side. He looked at her, his voice rough. "You and the boy safe now. This ride had to be made." She met his eyes and nodded, her breath steadying as if she believed him dead by the time the sun cleared the horizon. The sheriff had the riders tied to his saddle, and the cowboy led the way toward town. The mist lifted, showing the trail for what it was, narrow but true. Each step the horse took felt like a turning of a page, carrying them closer to an ending the land itself seemed to demand. Back at the church, the preacher stood waiting, the bell rope in his hands. When he saw them return, he rang once, the sound rolling across the valley. Townsfolk gathered fast, their eyes wide at the sight of the bound riders, at the woman clutching her baby close, at the cowboy steady in the saddle beside her. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind in wheat. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. These men came to burn, to steal, to erase. They belong to the ranch foreman, and the ledger holds the proof. No more will this town bow to money that buys lies. His words struck deep, and the people shifted, faces hardening as if a fog had lifted from their own hearts. The cowboy slid from his horse, then turned to help the woman down. She stepped onto the ground, her knees weak, but she held the child with strength. The townsfolk pressed close, some ashamed for doubting, others curious, all waiting to see what would come next. The preacher raised his voice. This child was left in God's house. He was not left to be taken by greed or fear. He was given to show us our measure. He looked to the cowboy. And you, who stood when no one else would, have carried more than a child. You carried our chance to remember what is right. The cowboy shifted, uneasy under the weight of their eyes. "I only did what had to be done," he said. His voice was plain, stripped of pride. But the people heard more than his words. They saw the truth of his actions written in the lines of his face, the steadiness of his stance, the way he looked at the child as if the boy's life was more than his own redemption. The sheriff marched the riders toward the jailhouse. The boy who had first spoken of the ledger followed close, eager to see the foreman brought low. The townsfolk trailed after, buzzing with talk, with fire in their eyes not of fear, but of justice. The cowboy stayed by the woman's side, the baby, now asleep against her shoulder. For the first time in days, the sound of his breathing was calmed out. In the days that followed, the ledger was read in full. Every false brand, every stolen head of cattle, every bribe to quiet the law was laid bare. The foreman's name was inked in each page, binding him to deeds he could not deny. The town watched as the sheriff locked him away, the church bell ringing long that day to mark a turning. No more would fear of the ranch steer their lives. No more would whispers hold them. Quiet. The woman, now no longer alone, found her strength in the child she carried. The townsfolk who once looked away came with bread, with wood, with help to mend her fence. She smiled through tears, each kindness a balm against the days of loss. The preacher visited often, his prayers softer now, filled with thanks more than pleas, and through it all the cowboy stayed near, not with claim or demand, but with steady presence. He fixed broken boards, rode fence lines, stood watch when nights were long. Slowly, the people no longer called him drifter. They called him neighbor. The boy grew quick, his laughter chasing away shadows in the churchyard. The cowboy found himself smiling more, though he did not notice until others did. The woman's eyes softened when she looked at him, not in judgment, but in trust. And though the land still bore scars from hard years, a sense of hope rooted deep as if spring had come. Early. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, the woman stood beside the cowboy at the fence line. The baby, now toddling, played in the grass nearby. She spoke quiet, her voice almost lost in the breeze. You could leave now. No one would hold it against you. He watched the child stumble, then laugh, and he shook his head. I reckon I found something worth staying for. Her hand brushed his, and in that simple touch was all the answer either of them needed. The story of the widow's baby and the outcast cowboy spread beyond the town. Travelers spoke of it, carried by the sound of the church bell and the truth of a man who chose to stand. Folks remembered not the shots fired nor the misty trail, but the choice to protect when it mattered most. They remembered the strength of a woman who refused to give in, the steady hand of a sheriff who would not be bought, the voice of a preacher who called people back to what was right. But above all, they remembered the baby whose cry turned strangers into family and outcasts into guardians. And so the tale settled into the land, not with thunder, but with quiet roots. A child safe, a town changed, and a man once lost now found. The cowboy knew his past would always ride behind him like dust on the trail, but for the first time, he did not ride alone. He walked forward with purpose, his steps matching the heartbeat of a child who had once been left to cry in the church and was now held in arms that would never let go. Top of form, bottom of form.